Welcome back for another deep dive with us.
Yeah.
Today, we're going to be tackling a concept that I think is both familiar and surprisingly complex, and that is omnipotence.
Right.
What does it actually mean to have unlimited power?
Hmm.
We're going to be exploring this question using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on omnipotence.
Okay.
And let me tell you, uh, it gets into some really fascinating philosophical knots.
Yeah.
So have you ever heard that classic riddle, like if an omnipotent being could create a rock so heavy they couldn't lift it?
Oh, yeah.
That's just the tip of the iceberg of what we're going to be talking about today.
That's the one everybody always goes to.
Right.
It's a good one, though.
Yeah, it is.
It's a good one.
It's a good one.
I think what's so fascinating about omnipotence is that on the surface, it seems like such a simple idea, like you can do anything.
Right.
But as soon as you start to think about it, even for a little bit, you run into all these logical paradoxes and philosophical challenges.
Exactly. So let's start with just the basics. Like, how does the Stanford Encyclopedia even define omnipotence?
So the entry starts with kind of the most straightforward definition, which is that omnipotence is the power to bring about any state of affairs.
Okay.
Seems simple enough, right?
Yeah.
But the problem is that this definition immediately raises the question, can anything truly bring about the impossible?
Right.
Like, can you have the power to make a square circle or 2 + 2 = 5?
I see where this is going already.
Yeah.
It's like we're already hitting a wall
Oh, hitting a wall.
with this simple definition.
And that's why a lot of philosophers prefer to talk about maximal power instead of absolute omnipotence.
Okay.
So that means that a being doesn't necessarily have to be able to do literally everything,
Right.
but rather they possess the most power conceivable.
So instead of being able to do everything, it's more like they have the most power.
The most power.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
It's a little more nuanced,
It's
right?
a little more nuanced.
And to add yet another layer of nuance, the source material makes a distinction between power and ability.
Okay. That makes interesting.
So think of it this way.
Yeah.
You might be the world's greatest chess player, right?
Okay.
Right.
You have the ability to win any game, but if you're locked in a room with no chessboard,
Right.
you have no power to actually play.
Yeah.
So ability is the potential
Correct.
to do something, while power is the actual capacity to exercise that ability.
So even with an omnipotent being,
Yes.
context matters.
The context matters.
It's not just about the raw power, but it's about the circumstances.
That's right. Okay.
So that leads us to another really interesting question.
Okay.
Can omnipotence be shared?
Ooh,
Like, can there be multiple omnipotent beings?
that's a big one.
That's a huge question.
Yeah, and wouldn't that just inevitably lead to conflict?
Well,
If they both want opposite things,
yeah.
would they just be in constant stalemate?
That's exactly the problem.
Yeah, the Stanford Encyclopedia actually explores this using a thought experiment called the feather stalemate.
Okay.
So imagine two omnipotent beings.
Oh,
One wants to move a feather, and the other wants to keep it perfectly still.
that feather's not going anywhere.
Right.
It's stuck.
Neither being can achieve its goal,
Uh-huh.
which implies that neither one is truly omnipotent.
Yeah.
This thought experiment really highlights the absurdity of shared omnipotence.
I'm sure the Stanford Encyclopedia doesn't just leave us with the feather stalemate.
Of course not.
There must be counter-arguments.
They explore all the different philosophical positions on this.
Okay.
One argument is that truly omnipotent beings would have to share certain characteristics,
Okay.
like omniscience or perfect moral understanding.
They'd have to be kind of on the same page.
They'd be on the same page.
They wouldn't be fighting over a feather.
Right. Because of this shared nature, they would always agree on the best course of action and avoid conflict.
They would just know.
They would just know.
What should happen to that feather?
That's right.
Okay.
Now, the entry also considers analogies from other scientific concepts,
Okay.
like quantum entanglement,
Uh-huh.
where you have these interconnected particles that influence each other instantaneously.
Right.
However, as the source points out, even these analogies kind of break down when you apply them to the concept of shared omnipotence.
It's like the more you try to pin it down,
Yeah,
the more slippery it
It's a
gets.
slippery concept.
What about the idea of multiple identical omnipotent beings? That seems even more problematic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If you have multiple beings that are truly identical in every way, down to their thoughts, desires, and actions,
Mm-hmm.
can we really consider them separate beings at all?
That's a really good question.
This is another challenge raised by the source material.
It seems like we've already gotten pretty deep into the weeds of omnipotence.
Yeah, we're just getting started.
And I feel like we're just getting started. But before we move on, I have to bring up the classic philosophical riddle.
Here we
Can an omnipotent being
go.
create a rock so heavy that even they can't lift it?
The paradox of the stone.
The paradox of the stone.
This is the one that gets people thinking about the limits of even unlimited power.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It feels like a no-win situation.
it does.
No matter how you answer, you end up sort of limiting omnipotence.
It seems like a catch-22.
Yeah.
But as you might expect, the Stanford Encyclopedia offers some pretty insightful ways to approach this seemingly unanswerable question.
Okay.
Yeah. So the source material actually distinguishes between two types of omnipotent beings
Okay.
when addressing this paradox of the stone.
Okay.
So first you have the essentially omnipotent being, like the traditional concept of God. For this type of being, the very notion of being non-omnipotent is like inherently contradictory.
Right.
It's like talking about a square circle. It's just like the concept itself is logically flawed.
So for an essentially omnipotent being, the question is almost meaningless
Yeah.
because it presupposes a limitation that they just can't have.
Precisely.
Okay.
Now things get a little more interesting when we consider the second type,
Okay.
which is the accidentally omnipotent being.
Accidentally omnipotent.
So this would be a being who wasn't always all-powerful, but somehow acquired omnipotence.
Okay, so like a superhero who gets their powers through
Right.
some cosmic event.
A cosmic event or, science experiment gone wrong.
Okay, got it.
Something like that.
Yeah.
So imagine this accidentally omnipotent being decides to create the immovable stone.
Okay.
But then later on, they lose their omnipotence. So
Yeah.
they could hypothetically create a limitation for themselves
Right.
that would only come into effect after they're no longer omnipotent.
That's so interesting.
It's a really fascinating way to think about how the nature of omnipotence itself might change over time.
It really highlights how much our understanding of omnipotence really depends on the context
Absolutely.
and the specific type of being that we're talking about.
Yeah, and it gets even more complex. When we start exploring the limits of power, even for those who are supposedly all-powerful.
Wait, so even omnipotence has limits?
You would think so, right?
I thought that was like the whole point. You can do anything if you're omnipotent.
Yeah, you would think.
Yeah.
But the Stanford Encyclopedia lays out some really compelling arguments for why even unlimited power might have boundaries.
Okay.
So let's start with the most obvious one.
Okay.
Past events.
Okay.
Can even an omnipotent being change something that has already happened?
So like going back in time and stopping a meteor from hitting the Earth?
Exactly. The
Yeah.
past is fixed.
Yeah.
Whether it's a raindrop falling or, Socrates drinking hemlock.
Right.
Once it's happened, even omnipotence can't undo it.
Okay, I can get on board with that.
Yeah.
What other limitations are there?
So logical impossibilities are another big one.
Okay.
Some things are just inherently incoherent,
Right.
regardless of how much power you have.
Like wishing for a married bachelor.
Ex-
Or a round square.
Those are just word games.
Yeah.
Like they're contradictions in terms.
Yeah. They don't actually mean anything.
And the Stanford Encyclopedia gives this great example.
Okay.
The Amazon River flooding less than 4 times, but an odd number of times.
Yeah.
No amount of power can make that happen because it's logically contradictory.
It's like trying to divide by 0.
Exactly.
The math just doesn't work.
The math doesn't work.
So even omnipotence has to play by the rules of logic.
It seems so.
Okay.
And then there's the question of free will.
Okay.
If genuine free will exists, can even an omnipotent being truly force someone to make a specific choice?
I mean, couldn't they just like manipulate the circumstances so perfectly
Right.
that the person would have to choose that way?
They could certainly try,
Yeah.
but if free will is truly free,
Right.
it shouldn't be susceptible to any kind of external manipulation,
Right.
no matter how subtle or powerful.
Yeah.
The source material suggests that an omnipotent being might be able to, influence or persuade, but they couldn't override genuine agency
Right.
without violating the very concept of free will.
So even with unlimited power, there's sort of a respect for the structure of reality.
That seems to be a recurring theme here.
Yeah.
Now, with all this talk of limitations, you might be wondering,
Right.
if even omnipotence has boundaries, is it even a coherent concept?
Yeah, it starts to feel a little wishy-washy.
Right.
Like how can something be all-powerful if it can't do certain things?
That's a great point, and the Stanford Encyclopedia acknowledges this challenge
Okay.
and presents 2 main approaches
Okay.
to analyzing omnipotence in light of its limitations.
Okay.
The first is called unrestricted repeatability.
Unrestricted repeatability.
So this approach argues that omnipotence isn't about being able to do literally everything,
Okay.
but rather about being able to bring about any state of affairs that can be repeated infinitely,
Okay.
without contradicting the laws of logic or requiring impossible actions like changing the past.
So like making a ball bounce 1,000,000 times.
Yeah.
Or 1,000,000,000 times.
Or an infinite number of times, because
Yeah.
that action is repeatable
Right.
without violating any fundamental rules.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, so that's the first approach.
Okay, what's the second one?
The second approach is called shared histories.
Shared histories.
Okay, and it suggests that we can analyze omnipotence by comparing what's possible in different worlds that are identical up to a certain point and then diverge.
Okay, so like two parallel universes.
Exactly.
That are exactly the same until like 1969.
Exactly. And then one follows our history and the other takes a totally different path.
Got it.
In this view, an omnipotent being could do anything that's possible in any of those diverging worlds,
Okay.
as long as it's consistent with the shared history up to the point of divergence.
So like within the possibilities that are allowed by what's already happened,
That's a great way to put it.
an omnipotent being has free reign
Yes,
to kind of create whatever they want in those branching timelines.
exactly.
Okay, I like that.
So both of these approaches acknowledge the limitations of omnipotence, like the inability to change the past.
Right.
But they still try to define like a scope for unlimited power that's logically coherent.
It's like a balancing act.
It really is.
But you mentioned earlier there's like one more big question that we need to tackle.
Yes.
Can God be both omnipotent and morally perfect?
Ah, yes. That's the question that has plagued theologians and philosophers for centuries.
It does seem like a paradox.
It does.
If God is all good,
Yeah.
how can he possibly have the power to do evil things? It really does feel like a paradox. Like, if God can do literally anything,
Right.
wouldn't that include the power to do evil acts?
Right.
So how can we reconcile that with the idea of a perfectly good and benevolent God?
Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia addresses this problem head on.
Okay.
They explore all these different philosophical arguments that attempt to resolve this apparent contradiction.
Okay.
One argument that's often used in like traditional theodicies is that if this is truly the best possible world that God could have created, then any evil that exists must serve a greater good, even if we can't really comprehend it from our limited human perspective.
So it's like saying that evil is a necessary ingredient in this huge cosmic recipe for ultimate goodness, even if we don't really understand the recipe.
That's one way to put it.
Okay.
Now, the source material also points out that if God exists eternally,
Right.
an imperfect omnipotent being couldn't exist alongside him.
Because that would contradict what we were talking about earlier.
Exactly.
That multiple omnipotent beings can't coexist
Right.
without creating paradoxes.
Right. You would just run into all sorts of logical problems.
Right.
So if God is the only omnipotent being,
Right.
and by definition he is morally perfect,
Right.
then the very existence of like an imperfect, evil, omnipotent being becomes impossible.
Okay. So it's not so much that God could choose to do evil,
Right.
but it's that the very nature of his being as the sole omnipotent entity
Yeah.
makes that possibility impossible.
That just doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Okay, and then what about the question of free will?
Yeah.
If humans actually possess free will,
Right.
could God really even force us to make certain choices?
Well, he might be able to influence us
Okay.
or guide us, but ultimately our decisions are our own.
So does that mean that God permitting evil might be the best option overall, even if he doesn't directly cause it?
That's a really complex theological question.
Yeah.
And the source material explores a lot of different perspectives on it.
Okay.
One idea is that allowing free will, even with the potential for evil consequences, creates a much more meaningful and valuable world
Right.
than one where humans are just basically puppets,
Right.
acting out God's predetermined script.
So it's like saying a world with genuine love and compassion and creativity just wouldn't be possible
Yeah,
without the risk of hatred and cruelty and destruction.
it's two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, like they have to both exist
Yeah.
in order for it to be meaningful.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, the Stanford Encyclopedia also acknowledges alternative theistic views,
Okay.
like those put forward by the philosopher Alvin Plantinga,
Mm-hmm.
which don't require this world to be the absolute best possible world,
Yep.
but rather simply the best that God could create given certain constraints.
So maybe we're getting too caught up in the idea of perfection.
Right.
when it comes to God's creation.
Yeah, maybe it's more about the best possible outcome,
Right.
within a set of limitations that even omnipotence can't overcome.
That's really interesting.
It is.
Wow, this has been a truly mind-bending deep dive.
It
What
has,
I'm taking away from this is that omnipotence is way more nuanced
for sure.
and complex than I originally thought.
Yeah,
Even unlimited power, it seems like, has its boundaries,
it does.
whether that's logic or time or the free will of others.
Right. The Stanford Encyclopedia's exploration of omnipotence really shows us that it's not just like a simple on-off switch,
Right.
but it's this concept with inherent complexities and even paradoxes.
Yeah.
It really challenges us to think critically about the nature of power, the limits of logic,
Yeah.
the very structure of reality.
And it reminds us that even the most seemingly straightforward ideas can lead us down these really fascinating philosophical rabbit holes.
Absolutely.
So to our listeners, we encourage you to keep pondering these questions.
Yeah.
What are the true limits of omnipotence?
Right.
Does the existence of evil challenge our understanding of a benevolent God?
It's a huge question.
These are questions that have no easy answers,
Right.
but I think that's what makes them so intriguing.
Absolutely.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the world of ideas.
And remember, there's always more to learn.
Yes, there is.
That's what makes this journey of philosophical exploration so rewarding.